Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the A4Q Testing Summit edition 2025. We have had amazing presentations during the day, and we have loads coming your way. But in this presentation, I'm very excited to have Martijn Goossens with me, and he will be discussing shifting left using BDD. So before I give over to him, I just want to remind everybody that we have a Q&A session at the end. So pop your questions in the chat so that he can address all of them. And we also have our best presentation and best speaker awards. So nominate him for these awards on the testingsummit.com website, but I'm not going to take up any more of your time. So Martijn, I'm giving the stage over to you to tell us a little bit more about your topic.
Thank you, Nalaine. And I just remember that I didn't ask you how to pronounce your name, so sorry if I butchered it. Anyway, hi, my name is Martijn Goossens, and today I'll be talking about how to shift left using BDD, or behavior-driven design. And before we dive into that, let's also discuss that we will cover cucumbers, gherkins, and also some fridges along the way. But don't worry, I'll take you through it. But first, a bit about myself. My name is Martijn Goossens. I traveled 39 times around the sun, and that's a pretty cool achievement, I think. I live in the Netherlands, and music was my first love. But, you know, my wife might have caught up with that. I still go to concerts, but my wife, you know, I see her every day. I've been in Agile for 17 years, and I've been in QA for 22 decades already, with a specialism in e-commerce. I've been in different fields, but, you know, e-commerce has a close heart to me every time I shop on Amazon or something like that. Anyway, why am I talking about behavior-driven design, shift left? I think that quality is everywhere in the process, but I also think that quality in is quality out, or any sort of way that you can say that. But where then do we put this in the entire process of software delivery? So I'll briefly take you through what agile testing means to me, and I hope to also sort of set the baseline for everything else in this topic. But I do think that most of us are working in an agile manner, Scrum, Kanban, or extreme programming, something like that. Scrum or Fall, if you're a purist. But that typically means that your testing is somewhere in the cycle. And I think that traditionally we see that testing sits sort of at the end of that. And if you recognize this, maybe throughout your career, maybe not today, but you might also recognize your Scrum board. And it could sort of look something like this, where we have something to do, we take it into progress, and our lovely developers pick things up. And then somebody says, hey, it's your time to shine. But I also think that that is not definitely quality, or how we should do quality, right? So could we maybe get rid of that test column and define in progress as everything that is quality? Because ultimately our work sort of leans into this amount of work at that amount of time. We sit in with requirements analysis. We might look at designs. We, collaborate with the developers when they code it, but ultimately we have to do the thing when everybody says it's ready to test. I don't fully agree with this, but I still see many teams that I coach, or, I'm a consultant nowadays, so I get to see many companies and many processes. I don't think that this is right. I think our work sort of should shift left, because I also think that our work then would become more valuable, more easy, because everybody takes it along for the ride. If we know about use cases, test cases, pitfalls, risks, risk analysis, before we actually develop something, I think that helps quality in the end, and also helps us maintain a good workload, right? There's no peak where everything needs to happen, and we sort of get involved early in the process. That's what shift left means to me. So where I think testing should be is not necessarily here, but it's definitely there early in the process. But don't forget that we also need to test in production, shift right, look at monitoring and production logs. But it's also when we collaborate with our teammates. Ultimately, I hope we also collaborate with our PO and backlog items and make sure that they have good acceptance criteria, good usability notes, that kind of stuff. And maybe we should also look at what is the outcome of our sprint retrospective, because is quality also not the way we work? And lastly, I think it should also be in the input for a sprint. So quality should be everywhere and on production forever. But this is not a talk about holistic quality. I do have talks about that, but this talk specifically talks about shifting quality to the left. And for me, that sits in two places. That's the product backlog on one side, where we help the PO and our team to have quality backlog items that everybody understands. There's no misconceptions, and we all know what actually will be delivered at the end of the sprint. Ultimately, when the sprint starts, just before, that's when we want to have quality. That's where we want to shift left. We want to know that everything is in before we actually start, right? Because ultimately, if we don't do this, what we see in our company is that when we help companies, everybody sort of wants to jump in. Every developer says, oh, you want this? I have a prototype ready for you, and then we can ship it tomorrow. And that is nice and that is fast. That is what Scrum and Agile promises. But I also see that a lot of rework then comes into the next sprint and the one after and the one after. I'm not even speaking about those production issues on Friday afternoon, and we all have to do overtime in the weekend, right? So this undesirable rework is something that we want to prevent when we shift left. We want to make sure that we're building the right thing. Now, don't forget about shift right, because ultimately that's the end of the loop, which means it's also the start of the loop. But I won't bother you too much with shifting right today. I think we need to change the mindset in our teams. And I typically bring this lovely quote. If you want to build a ship, then don't drum up people to collect the wood and assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Because if people really want to go on that voyage, if people really want to build quality software, then they will do whatever it takes, even the things that you didn't think of, right? And that sort of leans into everybody's expertise and makes sure that everybody is an expert and brings the best to everything that we build instead of just the thing that they do. It's an aspiring quote, but there's also a Dilbert comic that I want to bring to you, because ultimately I think that people work best if they have autonomy, if they are the master of their craft, but also if they have understanding of what they're actually building and why they are building it. In many teams, I see that development teams are being delivered product backlog items, and the PO doesn't really explain why we need it. And to me, that's an issue, because why are we doing this? Why is this quality? Why does it deserve quality? Why are we putting time into this and not, doing refactoring, rework, or, working on that technical depth? So we need to cross the river. We want to build a bridge. That's sort of everybody taking ownership and expertise. And everybody sort of can lean into that and help. Now, we can do this with behavior-driven development. And this is where I promised to talk about pickles. Because when I do this talk, I get a lot of questions. Oh, is this about cucumber? Oh, I've heard about given, when, then. Is this about gherkin? Not really. They are sort of syntaxes that you can use when you do BDD, but BDD is sort of more of a mindset. And that's what I want to dive into now. Trust me, we'll get back to those pickles, but let's leave them on the table for now. So BDD is defined by Scaled Agile as the process that moves through three different phases: a discovery phase, a formulation, and automation, where the acceptance criteria are transformed into acceptance tests and later automated. I think most of you will recognize sort of this flow, right? You get a product backlog item, you try to understand what it actually says, and then we go ahead and we code it in whatever cool framework that you're building on now. Is it Playwright? Is it Cypress? Is it anything cool with APIs? We can do all of the above, but BDD is more about the discovery and understanding what we are trying to build so that you, as an expert in testing, can then apply what those acceptance criteria should look like. What is quality if we are trying to build that? A fellow speaker who I will see at a later stage later this year, Goiko Atzik, he wrote a couple of books that we read in preparation of a workshop that we give, and I read in preparation of this talk. It's good to have this as sort of a library to sync back to if you want to sort of dive deeper into this, but I'll take you along about some of the things in here, and more specifically, specification by example. Now, I talked about gherkin and cucumber. Specification by example is a method, I would call it, and it ensures that we bring business and IT closer together. It ensures that we have a common understanding, and it gets rid of assumptions, ambiguity, misunderstandings, and it helps to bring those requirements, those tests, and documentation together into one process. So there's a couple of things going on, but ultimately, we're doing this to get 3 different outcomes at the same time, saving you a lot of time, I hope. Now, it's not a silver bullet, right? So specification definitely isn't a testing method. You can sort of derive test cases from it, but you would not sort of apply it like black box testing and equivalence partitioning and that kind of stuff. But you'll see that later on. This is something that you do with the entire team and not necessarily on a finished iteration. It's also not a test automation method. So just like gherkin and cucumber are not test automation methods, it will help you enhance and improve your test automation because you better understand what we are testing and what quality means to whatever we're building. But it's not a method to do your test automation. I already mentioned it's not going to solve all your problems, but it's going to eliminate some. So it's not a silver bullet and definitely not a replacement of other agile testing practices. I'll come back later to that big agile scrum loop and show you sort of where this sits and help you also implement this in your process. But that's for later on when we actually understand what specification by example does and how it works. Now, before I dive into the nitty-gritty of example mapping, sort of what I think success means to a product iteration, a software product, whatever you're building in your company, that it sort of lives on 2 axes. One is we want to build the right thing and we want to build the thing right. And building the thing right is more in architecture and ways of working. This is more about understanding that we're building the right thing, the thing that the customer wants, your end user, that the business is helped with, because then we can define quality and success by the outcome of what we do. As mentioned, I will go into the method of example mapping. There's a few ways you can do behavior-driven development and design, but example mapping, I think, is a very bare bones and easy one to dive into. And I think everybody can sort of apply it in their process when they are sort of creating the requirements and product backlog items. So let's look at what that looks like. You're going to need a lot of stickies, but it's Scrum. Example mapping. So it's a structured way of getting to examples of your requirements. It also makes problems with large stories very visible, and people are visual thinkers. So I think that's also very helpful. And if that is very visible, then we can also create smaller snippets of user stories. So that also helps in quality because ultimately the mindset of Scrum and Agile is to build smaller things and iterate on them, right? This also stops the discussions on the little things. We can park them, as I will show you in a bit. And ultimately, it delivers those documentations out of 3 Amigo sessions. If you have not heard about 3 Amigo sessions, I'll explain later. We'll first cover what example mapping sort of looks like. Now, the format of example mapping is very colorful and pretty easy. Let's see if you can follow this. There's a 4-color structure where on the top, yellow, the product owner basically explains the user story. This is what the business wants. For example, this could be free delivery on an e-commerce website. I hope that most of you have ordered something online in the last year, so you might sort of recognize this use case. Free shipping comes with its own very specific rules. One could be that the order value should be over 20 euros or dollars or whatever you pay with. That could be a rule. We use blue stickies for those. And many rules can sort of precede or, work against them. I'll also show some examples on how to work with that later. But this is the concept of a rule. It explains something that your user story needs to do, to abide by. Now, not everybody will understand what rules are, and I will show you some examples. But rules basically follow, and then we want to understand that we're all on the same page, that we have the same understanding. We use green stickies for those examples. And one way to think about this in an easy way is, have you seen Friends, the TV show? Every TV show series started with a title, the one where this and this happened, the one where Joey kicks out Rachel. I don't know. But in our use case of free shipping, it could be the one where the order value is 15 euros or where the order value is 25 euros. Then we will get free shipping. So that's an example to our rule of free shipping. Now, you probably have a lot of questions, and so might your colleagues as well. We write those down on red stickies. Now, input is very much valued, so anything that you can write down on a blue or green sticky, please do that first, because everything is a question nowadays, but it helps to collaboratively enhance and create your example map. So don't just pick the red stickies and write only questions. Try to enhance things and create duplicates. We want to sort of diverge and get all the input we can from everybody in the room, and then sort of see where the overlap is, where we already understand each other, and maybe some things need to be figured out. That's actually where this is very powerful, because those questions typically lead to enhancements and understanding and quality of the user story. So I'll dive deeper into the process, but don't get red stickies for questions for everything. Please know that you can, and you can park questions. So that's for later. Just know you have an escape, and you don't have to add to this or just sit on your hands, right? I promised you an example. We will stick with the free shipping. So the input and output, when I order one book and the price is $19.99, the shipping cost is, well, $3.95. However, if I order 2 books and the total price becomes 20 euros, that's when we have the rule that anything above 20 euros, we get free shipping. We might also order just one book, which is very expensive, a $35 book. It's probably not an ebook, but the shipping costs should be 0. Now, we are testers, and we might find that sort of outlier. What about one book and a refrigerator? The total price is going to be way up the roof and almost $800, but are we still sure that shipping costs are free? Because, we need to get a truck instead of just a small van, and we need to pay the truck driver. So are we really sure that the shipping costs are free? What about that fridge? Now, these types of examples show that we might sort of want to tweak the user story. This might become a known issue, or we want to fix it right away, depending on what the business wants. But by creating these examples, we suddenly have understanding of what we need to build and how it needs to work when it's finished. Shipping cost might be very easy, but what if you have sort of consecutive rules, things that follow each other, right? The sort of guideline for this that we advise is that you sort of go from left to right. The most important rule, the thing that needs to work all the time, goes on the left side. Anything that follows, for example, is there a fridge included or any electronics device, or it could be weight, that could be the second rule. So first we check if the order value exceeds our free shipping limit. Second, we check if the weight doesn't exceed a small van limit. This is a way that you can enhance your example mapping. And we have seen this in workshops, that this is something that typically drills down into what developers recognize as being very close to what they build as unit tests. Now we sort of have this output. We have a user story with some great rules that we will implement, some examples that we can test against. And we know that if we run those at the end, that they will work, right? Because we automated them. We can sort of input those in the system. We can start building, we can start coding, but we also want to sort of document everything here, because ultimately we want everybody, our users, future developers, future team members, to understand why we built this and how we built this. It becomes our living documentation. And it's super important to make sure that you store this the right way. Now, what we typically advise is a feature tree as a way to sort of document all your findings. This sort of goes on a tangent on where to store stuff, but typically this is a question that we get when we talk about BDD and all the output that we're creating, because just storing it in a Jira ticket is not really a time-standing feature, right? So please use something like Confluence or any documentation tool that you use. Feature sets could be any drill down of how your application works. It could be screens, it could be flows. In your current iteration down below, you can store things temporarily as you're sort of building and working on a story during your sprint. And lastly, if there's known regression issues, you want to sort of have that easily accessible and findable. So known regression issues are sort of also from the main tree, from the home page. Again, this is a small tangent on storing your outcomes. Let's also look at some success indicators of how you use BDD, right? I mentioned this a few times, that you do this with the entire team. You want everybody's input and output. So if we have everybody in the room and we sort of finish with the example mapping, this is when we sort of have a clear understanding from those examples. Everybody has seen and understood those examples. If not, you can sort of ask questions and probe about the questions, examples that somebody wrote down, and we make sure that the model is aligned. Any developer, any tester, any team member that works on this story has the same understanding of what we are building and what will work and how it will work when we finish. Also, we want to sort of make sure that we use common names for attributes. I have seen some teams that struggle with naming and wording, but this sort of makes sure that everybody's on the same page when we use a word for or a term for something. In some ways, we also see that the typical things that people run into when they do example mapping is that there's one user story, the yellow sticky, and there's a really big long line with blue rules. Now, it could be very true that this user story has so many rules, but typically this is a modeling problem. And if you have a modeling problem, there's two things that could be happening. One, it's a user story that's way too big to pick up. There's too many rules to implement, and it will take 5 developers 5 weeks to create this, and no single tester or PO is ever going to test this in a week. You might have a modeling problem, and you might want to cut up your user stories and examples. This is a very easy method because ultimately you just ordered all those rules in an order of priority. So you might just start with the first 3 or 4 rules and, park all the other rules with a second follow-up user story to enhance anything that you build in the first sprint. It could also be that there's a difference in mental models, that people have a misunderstanding of what this user story actually needs to do. So with everything very visible, and you can actually point to your questions, this is where you go to your product owner or business representative and say, this is a lot of work and this is a lot of rules. It seems to be very complex. And are you okay with that? That is where your business owner or product owner or whatever you call them in your team can actually help you and your team to make decisions, right? So making things visible is very useful in this stage. I quickly mentioned diverging and converging. How we typically set up this process, and this is more than how you can apply this in your work. This can replace your typical refinements, because I don't think most refinements are really fun to be part of, because, people just shout into the room. There's one person behind a laptop writing everything down. In this case, we have a lot of stickies and everybody just writes things down in silence. When we all have understood that big yellow sticky with the user story, we sort of diverge and we sort of let out all our ideas on paper. We let everybody think. So everybody's input is sort of collected and made sure that it's part of what we're building, because sort of the consensus will sort of enhance the quality of anything your team does. They're experts in your team. Why not use them? But all those stickies need to converge for you to have a successful example map. So after 5 minutes or whenever everybody's pen is down, make sure that you see where the duplicates are, where you can easily sort of mix and match, and make sure that everybody's on board with your lean and smaller version of the example map, where all the necessities are in, but all the extra ideas are documented for a later time. So the converging is a very important step that you do as a group. So when you do this as a group, there's a few success factors that you can look out for to make this work. And this sort of also can translate to your refinements if you think that they need work. I think a great introduction is a great start, right? Quality in is quality out. So the business goal needs to be explained and understood by everybody, and we place the story in the project or software where it needs to be. Is it on a very specific page or a few elements? We need to better understand. Then you do some bare minimum questions, some things that are on the tip of your tongue, things that you want to get out of the way before you write down your ideas. Now, if everybody has sort of the first good starting point, that's when we sort of diverge. We diverge solo and we merge together. So we respect people's thinking time. It might be that you're done after 2 minutes because you're not that, experienced in the thing that we're building. But other people are writing. So respect people's thinking time. You can start removing duplicates and enforce those rule and example priorities, making sure that the first things happen first, and resolve the easy questions, because those questions is something that you dive into sort of at the end, but it might be that one of those questions is a very easy answerable rule that you can add very easily. Before you sort of finish up and wrap up, you need to make sure that you have an answer to who will document this into the user story, how will we write it down, and who will follow up those questions that we haven't resolved. And typically they go to the business or a very specific expert in the team, like data or marketing, sales, somebody who can really help you enhance the understanding of the user story. I promise to get back to those pickles, because how are you going to write down these user stories with these examples and these rules? You could use Gherkin and Cucumber for this in a given when then syntax, but it might also be very restrictive. So I'm not the biggest fan of Cucumber and Gherkin, but I have sort of advised it to teams where I did see it could work because they were already sort of thinking along this way. Pick your own path, but know that there are syntaxes that can help you ease up sort of the framing. But what I've also done is just copy paste the output from an example map and just posted a picture or linked a Miro board to any Jira ticket. Output is very important in behavior-driven design because ultimately we need to work with it. In this next chapter, I will show you where to put BDD to properly shift left and where example mapping actually will help you and your team. So let's dive deeper into that. This is what I call behavior-driven development, the complete process. So this is a very big chart, and it basically shows, from scrum.org, how something goes from a vision to actual working software. And from the bottom left, we go into ideation, and somebody has a big, brilliant idea, and it's based on customer needs, product scope, value proposition. We call that business modeling. And all the way up on the right, you will see that your product backlog item becomes very specific. It becomes smaller. It's broken down into multiple iterations. So you can easily sort of dive into what it means and what examples are. Sort of at the end of the journey, when you start to do requirements analysis and refinements, that's where example mapping lives. So on the bottom right-hand side of the graph, you will see that the acceptance criteria and examples are sort of gathered by specification by example. This is where you can help yourself enhance the quality. Ultimately, there's a business goal. We define the scope and who's going to use it. What does it need to do? We come up with some key examples of how this needs to work. Those become specified with example, specification by example, it's in the name. Those have executable specifications. You could, run this manually. You could automate this. It could be in a unit test, API, or maybe even functional if you really wanted it to. But ultimately, the thing that we build is documentation, for your application. And you can use the outcome of a example map for anything. So ultimately, those examples become tests that verify requirements because those requirements, they illustrate those examples. This is from the professional product owner by scrum.org, Jochem McGreel, probably not pronouncing it right. But I fully agree that the outcomes of BDD, behavior-driven design, is super important from start to finish. It helps us at the start to create that alignment. In the middle, we make sure that it does the behavior thing that we want it to do. And how we built that is up to the technical decisions. But ultimately, we need to test that that works because that's the requirement. I mentioned that we do this process with a few people in the room, but we might also be able to enhance it using 3 Amigos sessions. And I want to sort of dive into that as well. I mentioned that I traveled 39 times around the sun, and this picture is from a very old movie, so I hope that some of you recognize it. But 3 Amigos. What does it mean and how does it work? I've done many refinements over the time in my career, and basically this picture is how I felt every time. Not every time, but most of the times, right? It's a write and review process with ad hoc conversations because only one person in the room can speak. It might be the loudest developer. It could be your rock star PO, but ultimately we're not getting everybody's input and we just need to wait our turn. Again, there's only one person writing down the things on their laptop. They're probably not engaged because they need to write down all the things that everybody's shouting. I think those sessions are energy draining. They don't bring me a lot of joy. There's sort of long discussions on smaller things where we also might drift away from good ideas. And by doing it this way, I think there's limited progress on the backlog because everybody's doing the same thing for one user story every time. And I don't think real alignment is taking place. So can this be better? Yes, it can. Find your 3 Amigos. Now, The use techniques are very close to what I just mentioned that we do in example mapping. We diverge the ideas, we merge them to sort of a very concise and exact thing, and then we formalize it and output it to the world, or in this case, our software development team. Starting points for your 3 Amigo sessions, I think those ingredients are already in your team. There's typically a business person like a PO. There's a technical engineer that we call a developer or software engineer or whatever they are called in your company, and somebody who tests things, who looks at things in a way that we look at risk and we want to represent our end user. We can call them QA, or anybody who's listening today. We typically want to have a facilitator, especially when you're starting to do 3 Amigo sessions, because learning something new is very helpful if you can focus on it and somebody else is sort of keeping track on a time box and helping you guide the things. It's not necessary, but having a facilitator who's already free from not going to refinements is very helpful. We sort of aim for a 20-minute time box because you can get to examples and rules for a smallish user story in that time set. If you haven't, you can take them away and bring them home, but that's sort of the time box that we suggest. And you can practice with smaller stories. Because ultimately, we don't want to dive into this age-old way of working where the product owner just throws over the story, the dev throws over the software, and we sort of throw back all the bugs. We want to make sure that the alignment happens, and everybody has a different way of thinking and things to sort of bring back to the table. So ultimately, shifting that to one common aligned solution, making sure that quality is there. Sort of going back to that example, right? Deriving the scope. Your product owner might knock on your door tomorrow and they say, as a marketing manager, I want the system to offer free delivery on certain items so I can entice customers to order more. Wouldn't that be great? Earning more money. So your business analyst is going to be very helpful. And they say, well, everything above 20 euros is free. Great. So a developer looks at it from a technical point of view and they say, well, we might want to have a shopping cart that sort of validates all of that. And then your tester goes, but what about that fridge? Now, I think I want to sort of end my session with success factors of 3 Amigo sessions. We've looked at example mapping that you can bring to those sessions. And now by also limiting the time spent in your team, we can make sure that you enhance your quality with less people in a less amount of time. Wouldn't that be great, right? So make sure that your decision maker is present. Either someone from the business or a representative that can make a decision that yes or no, this needs to be in. Yes, this is included, or no, it's not. We also want to make sure that there's an introduction by business or somebody who understands why we need this. Then go into an exploration from all your sort of experiences and expertises. A developer will look at it from a technical side. We will look at it from a risk side. And maybe the business analyst can also help with adding some extra rules or examples. Work towards that formalization. So if you've spent half of your time box on the exploration, we might want to start, reducing the duplicates and making sure that the most high priority rule has a few examples that we understand them with. Not too many examples because we can also go crazy and specify everything. And then follow up. Make sure that every question that has been brought to the table is also followed up by somebody in the business or an expert that can help you. A facilitator, and I've been a facilitator many times, they can help to identify long discussions and make sure that they park them on a red sticky. They can help and keep an eye on the time box. Make sure that if we do a 5-minute diversion on our own and it's very silent for 5 minutes, that we also break up the time and make sure that we go to the formalizing and checking if we have duplicates. And the last 5 minutes typically go into formalizing and making sure that we understand what are the next steps. Do we need another session or can we pick this up in the next sprint? And they have an eagle eye of the view of the session. So if they feel that somebody's not heard or understood or gets to speak, they can also make sure that the team is enhanced and everybody's heard. Start small. Don't pick your biggest backlog item, because that's probably going to only cause you a lot of problem and you're not going to keep to that time box. Practice small and then work your way up until you see that you need to cut up your examples left to right. That's sort of when you understand how big your user stories actually can be. Lastly, make it part of your process. So going back to that earlier slide, I need to find it because I didn't put it at the end. Beep, 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 beep. Here we go. So this is where we shift left using BDD example mapping. We want to make sure that we do it somewhere between those pink lines, that we understand that the product backlog items are the right things for us to build. And also, just before the sprint, make sure that everybody understood the outcome of the example map. Especially if you do 3 Amigo sessions, you might want to run the output against the whole team and say, this is what the 3 of us came up with. Maybe you have some additional output or some very critical questions that we need to resolve before we pick this up. You can do this as an enhancement to your refinement, where you don't really dig down onto everything with the whole team, but first sort of do a pre-refinement with the 3 Amigo sessions, and then sort of go into the refinement with a few user stories with rules, examples that you can actually put an estimation to. If you use story points, hours, whatever, but everybody better understands what it is, and we can make sure that it's small enough for us to pick up. So this is specification by example, a way of doing behavior-driven design. And I think you can apply it to your daily work and in software delivery from tomorrow on. And if you have any questions, you can make sure to find me somewhere online. I am on LinkedIn. You can email me or go to my webpage, which is very bare bones, but you know where to find me. And there's a Q&A section right now. So I hope that some of you have already posted some questions in the chat. Well, let's have a look.
Thank you, Martijn, for this very interesting presentation. And yes, we do have some questions. So let's jump right into that so that we can give them some feedback. Let's have a look. Are there situations where BDD might not be the most viable solution to shift left?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I like it because I actually sort of gave a workshop last year at a company where I wasn't sure if BDD was, going to help with them. They were a company who were doing, I can't say too much because, confidentiality things, but they were working with routers and doing very technical stuff with bandwidth and that kind of stuff. What they mentioned and what they ran into when I did my workshop is that a lot of their user stories were very technical, and behavior-driven design, the behavior of users and systems, needs to be sort of apparent and something that you work with when you want to sort of focus on behavior-driven design. They sort of made it work, and they were one of my first clients who actually asked for a follow-up workshop. That was very cool. But if you work in a very highly technical domain, then behavior-driven design might not be the best way to go. There are still things that you want to do when, shifting left, because quality and understanding of what you're trying to build, even in a technical environment, is super important. But you might want to sort of steer away from given, when, then, and really like user understandable flows if everything you're going to write down is ones and zeros.
Great. Thank you so much for providing feedback or answering that question. Let's quickly have a look at another question. You can prepare before you go to a refinement?
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of piece these two questions together. Because the first question is, are these requirements or not? And you can prepare them before a refinement. I am a big fan of pre-refinements because better understanding what we're trying to discuss and build also helps a product owner to refine their user stories. So yes, this is all about the requirements, because understanding those requirements makes sure that we as a team, as software developers, testers, designers, and everybody who's involved, that we're all aligned, that we can shed our expertise on the things that we're building. And doing this before you actually go into a room with the entire team and waste everybody's time for an hour, where you want to sort of end with, can we do this in the next week or 2 weeks? We want to make sure that those requirements are good and that we don't waste time. That's sort of also in the methods in this presentation. I hope this sort of answers your question, but I might have misunderstood it.
All right, then let's have a look at another question. And if this question was not properly answered, just give us a little bit more insight in the chat, then we can revisit the subject. But then the next question, what are common issues when people say BDD doesn't work?
Yeah, I've run my workshops and this presentation a few times, and I do get people come up to me and say, well, we've tried BDD, but well, it doesn't really work for us. And in one instance, they actually mentioned that they were in a very technical situation, and I said the same thing as I said earlier. BDD might not be the thing that you're looking for, but shifting left, I hope that mentality and the reason why we do that still sticks around and works for you. Other things that I see is that people look up BDD. The first thing that they see and hear is gherkin, BDD, given, when, then. There's other ways to sort of formulate it, like the results, requirements, and there's another one, verification. If you very strictly stick to that stigma, suddenly the usefulness of behavior-driven design, where everybody can understand it, everybody can use it and read it, sort of diminishes it, because you have a very strict thing that not everything fits into. You have a mold that doesn't necessarily work for every team, for every software or organization. So usually I sort of think that as that bell curve, like use BDD, don't use BDD, use BDD. It depends on how you apply it, and if you looked at your situation and made sure that this works or not for you. But I think that the concepts of BDD are very smart and wise, because everybody can get involved. It's not technical documentation that a UX person can sort of provide feedback to. And ultimately, using, for example, specification by example, you have your documentation, your test cases, and anything right from the get-go. And that's very powerful, useful, and saves you a lot of time, I think. So it might not have worked for other people, but I think it can work for many teams.
Perfect. We are a bit pushing it, but I do see there's a lot of interest in the questions that we're getting. So let's put on another question. Is it possible to use this on a higher level as well, not just user stories, but on epics or features?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe if you have access, I'll go to my slide where I show the entire process of different sort of ways to go on higher levels. Let me check if, yes, this one. So let's see if you can see my pointer. Nope. One. So specification by example, the thing that we talked about today, lives on the far right-hand top side. It's where we have the most details. But when you go and do this earlier in the process on a higher level, you might want to look at story mapping. This is a sort of, I want to say, similar sort of approach where you explore what we're actually trying to build. Impact mapping can be very useful to understand how you build things. And ultimately, I'm also a very big fan of event storming and domain-driven design workshops, where you sort of map out your entire flows or your entire architecture and make sure that everybody knows the flows before you dive into it with a specification by example or user stories specifically. So there's a few different ways. I wouldn't necessarily dive into rules and examples, because then you get to the nitty-gritty and you lose the entire high-over discussion. But this is typically some ways that I would help teams to understand it from different layers, if that helps.
Perfect. So we then have reached the end of our session. We're going to have to stop with the questions, but but please feel free to pop the questions into the chat. We will share it with Martijn, and he can then provide you with more information and discuss the topics in more detail. Before we say goodbye to everybody, I just want to remind you that this presentation, all the other presentations will be streamed. You can rewatch it on our testingsummit.com domain and our social media platforms. And then also, please remember to vote for this presentation on our website. We have the Best Speaker and the Best Presentation Awards that we will be announcing soon. So please visit the program and Martijn's landing page, and you can vote for this presentation there. So Martijn, thank you so much for having us, being with us today and for sharing your knowledge with us. It's been amazing, and I'm sure we will see you soon. Thank you to everybody that's joined this session, and we look forward to seeing you in the sessions that we have coming up. Thank you very much, and then goodbye for now.
Thank you, everybody.
Software testers. Move beyond theory and master testing with the AI-powered ISTQB add-on practical tester by A4Q program. The ISTQB add-on practical tester by A4Q equips you with the theoretical skills and practical competence to truly excel. Learn how to apply black box testing like a pro. Estimate accurately, write flawless defect reports, and catch issues early. The ISTQB add-on practical tester by A4Q complements your ISTQB certification by turning knowledge into powerful action. Visit our websites and find out more information.